I've been looking for a fixed gear freestyle bike for about 3 or 4 months, but unfortunately I live in Georgia, and that trend never actually got to Georgia. So finding a used bike is pretty difficult. I scanned Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist for about 3 months, and the only bikes that ever came up were not in Georgia. I would have to drive 4 or 5 hours to go pick them up in Florida or in North Carolina. That adds significantly to the cost of that bike, so then it wasn't really worth it. Then I found this, the Crew Bike Company Defender. It's an entry-level fixed gear freestyle bike from Crew Bike Company. I ordered it off of citygrounds.com. Let's open this box up and see what I bought. Here's a quick look at what's inside the box. Looks like we got both wheels here. This is the rear, and that's the front right there. We got the frame and fork over here. The handlebar is tied in down here. You probably can't see that real well. We got the seat and seat post on this end. Everything's real well wrapped, real well covered in foam and plastic. Got some cardboard in here for cushioning. Everything's zip tied together so it doesn't bang around in transit. So there you can get a better look at how it's packaged. Got a lot of cardboard in here, some tie wraps, lots of plastic and foam. Everything should be pretty scratch free. Got the chain hanging off over here, if you can see that. So I'm going to start taking it apart. You need to decide if you want a single speed with a freewheel so that you can coast, or if you want a fixed gear. I bought this to be fixed gear, so I'm going to put it with the fixed gear side on the side with the chain. So there we go, the Crew Defender. So this is my Crew Defender, which I assembled myself. One thing I do want to state for the record is that the website, they do not encourage you to assemble this bike yourself. In fact, it says that the warranty on the bike will be void if you don't have it assembled by a professional. So just keep that in mind if you buy this bike, that they're going to expect that you have a receipt from a bike shop that assembled the bike if you have any warranty claims. The model that I bought is the small medium size. I am 6 feet tall, but I have kind of short legs, so I tend to ride a smaller frame. And on top of that, I'm used to riding a BMX bike, which has a very small frame. So I went with the smaller size, and I'm glad I did. The standover height is just about right for me. It's right around 30-31 inches standover height from the ground. So that's just right for me. The frame and fork on this bike are 100% chromoly, according to their website. Now the frame is sort of designed like a road frame, but the forks are very much BMX style forks. They have a BMX crown, you know, BMX dropouts on the front. The fork is 1 1/8 inches threadless fork. We'll talk more about that in a minute. One thing that I noticed that bugs me a little bit, which is the weld job on it is a little substandard. This is an entry-level bike, and you can tell by looking at the welds. You see some of these, I can get my camera to focus on it. See these little bubbles and things in there? My phone doesn't really want to focus on this right now. It's trying to focus on, there they are, these little bubbles in the welds. Down here on the gusset, you can see them too right there, these little bubbles and kind of sloppy welding. That's pretty typical. I mean, it's an entry-level bike. This bike, price-wise and quality-wise, is probably on the lines of a retro spec or a state fixed gear. So if you've looked at one of those, you're getting very similar quality with this bike as you would if you bought one of those. The difference obviously is the geometry of this bike is going to be a little different than theirs. One nice thing about this frame compared to other bikes that I've had is the geometry is slightly more aggressive than a standard sort of road bike or road frame or even a mountain bike. The head tube angle, from what I can tell, is about 73 or 74 degrees. That's just an estimate. I don't know that for sure. Hey, it's Andy from the future. I measured the head tube angle and it comes out to 73.5 degrees. The one nice thing though is that the bottom bracket drop is very low. So the bottom bracket drop on this is actually only about 1 3/4 inches. I don't know what that is in millimeters off the top of my head, but it basically means the bottom bracket is significantly higher than on a standard mountain bike or on a standard road bike. Basically the clearance off the ground on this bike with these tires, the clearance from the ground to the center of this bolt is about 12 inches. On my old bike that I was riding, it was a little over 11 inches. So that gives me nearly an inch more clearance, which means that I can go more aggressively around corners and not worry as much about striking the pedals. So that's actually one really nice feature about the geometry of this bike. One feature that I don't like about the geometry of this bike is how much space there is right here between the wheel and the frame. I really want that wheel sucked up to the frame as tight as you can get it. I would want to get a solid inch taken out of this space if I could. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be possible. I don't have the wheel slammed. I just put it in at the distance that they gave me with this chain. I didn't do anything to break the chain and shorten it, anything like that. So the wheel is not slammed. You can see I actually have a little tiny bit of space right there. So I could slam the wheel and get, I don't know, 3/8 of an inch more closer to the frame up here. And I could even, if I really wanted to go nuts, I could even take a grinder to that dropout and carve it out just a little bit more, kind of in this area. Carve that a little deeper on both sides and slam the wheel even further up. But even so, the closest I'm going to get, I'm not going to get it an inch closer. I might be able to get it as much as 3/4 of an inch closer. But even that's not quite where I want it to be. This is about 1.5 inches in here. So kind of bummed about that. I wish it was a little tighter. I may go ahead and do that at some point, grind that out, but I'm not going to do it right now. Obviously that'll void the warranty on the bike. I need to interrupt again to talk about the axle nuts that came with this bike. These are the rear axle nuts that came with this bike. The rear wheel had these nuts on the axles and no washers. So these teeth on the nut are supposed to bite against the frame and keep the wheel from slipping when it's tightened down. The problem is that the way that this is designed with these teeth, when you turn it with the wrench, one side of the teeth tends to grab the frame and then it causes it to essentially act like a gear, which means that it moves the axle in that dropout. So it's almost impossible to get your chain tensioned correctly with these axle nuts. Also, they damage the frame because to get these tight, you're literally cranking these teeth against the frame and you're chewing up the frame in order to try and get it tight. If you plan to ever take the wheel off this bike to change the tube, to tighten the cog, which I had to do several times, to do anything on the bike, you're going to want to replace these axle nuts. These are terrible. These are what I found out in the shed. I actually pulled these off of an old wheel that I had laying around, and they're really nice. You can see they've actually got a built-in washer. So the axle nut turns independently of this built-in washer. And this is what I'm talking about. The washer actually has teeth. So when you tighten this against the frame, the washer will stay still, and you'll be able to tighten this nut against that washer, and it'll bite the frame just perfectly, and it won't slide around on you. It also means that it won't dig up your frame real badly. So I had to change out the axle nuts on the rear wheel on this bike to these. It's made a huge difference. It enables me to get my chain tensions correctly and to be able to take the wheel on and off without chewing up the frame. As I mentioned, the forks are BMX style forks with an 1 1/8" threadless steerer tube, which means this is an 1 1/8" headset. The bearing cups are machined straight into the frame. You can see they've got a lot of spacers in here. They got 3 tall spacers. It's got to be at least 1 inch, maybe more, space in here. It's got a BMX style front loader stem. Front loads are not popular these days in BMX. What's cool these days in BMX is top loader stems. But there's one advantage to a front load stem, and that is if you come around here to the back, you can see that the height of the stem here, the bar actually drops down from the top of the stem. If you want an extra inch of height on these bars, you can actually take the front off and loosen these bolts, take the bars off, and flip this stem upside down and put it all back together, and it'll actually raise the bars about another inch. So there is an advantage to a front loader stem, even though that's not really what's in style these days among the BMX crowd. Typical steel handlebars. One thing to know about the handlebars is they're BMX style handlebars, which means that this clamping thickness here is 7/8 of an inch. If you buy road bars, track bars, mountain bike bars, they will have an inch thick clamping surface, which means they won't fit in this headset. So keep in mind, if you want to change these bars out, you're going to need to get BMX style bars with a 7/8 inch clamping width. Otherwise, you're going to need a new stem as well. Standard generic brake levers. I'm not going to get into those too much yet. Knockoff mushroom style grips. Not the most comfortable knockoff mushroom grips I've ever had, but they're not bad, and they do come with bar ends, which is nice. Seat and seat post. It's your standard generic padded plastic seat. It's got steel rails under here, aluminum seat post. It's a 27.2 millimeter seat post, which is more of a road mountain bike standard. It's not a BMX standard. It's a little disappointing. 25.4 is BMX standard. I wish it was a BMX post, because then you could easily replace this with a pivotal seat and seat post. They do make pivotal seat posts in 27.2. They're just not as common. So be aware of that if you want to be aware of what that size is. It's a 27.2 if you want to replace that post and seat. The drivetrain on this bike is sort of a weird mishmash of pieces, sort of like the rest of it. I mentioned how it's got sort of BMX front end. It's got a BMX fork and BMX headset, BMX stem, but it does not have a BMX standard seat post. It also doesn't have a BMX standard bottom bracket. It has what's called a Euro bottom bracket, which is very common among road bikes, mountain bikes, Walmart bikes. Most of the bikes in the world probably have this Euro bottom bracket in it. But it's interesting because it has BMX cranks, and a Euro bottom bracket is not very common among BMX bikes, although it does show up once in a while. And you can get a new bottom bracket, a Euro bottom bracket for BMX cranks. So it's not totally weird, but it's certainly not common. The cranks are 170 millimeter steel, maybe chromoly, maybe. It doesn't say on the website what they are, so I tend to think they're probably steel. The one thing that does make me think they might be chromoly, well, there's two things actually. Number one is that 3-piece cranks are generally chromoly. You almost never see 3-piece cranks that are just plain steel. Generally, they're going to be chromoly. On top of that, I took one of these bolts out, one of these pinch bolts out of, that's not a pinch bolt, one of these cap bolts out of the end of the crank to take a look at it. cheaper BMX cranks have 8 splines. They look like 8 teeth, big chunky teeth that hold the cranks onto the axle. These actually have 48 splines, which is 48 little teeny ridges that go around the axle. Those are actually generally higher quality cranks that have 48 splines. So that kind of leads me to believe these are probably chromoly, but I can't guarantee that, so I don't know for sure. They are 170 millimeter, which is a little shorter than standard. Standard cranks are 175, but 170 is a little more standard among fixed gear. It gives you a little more pedal clearance when you're at the bottom, so when you're going around corners, you're not going to get a pedal strike. And it mixed especially with the higher bottom bracket that I mentioned earlier, you're a lot less likely to strike your pedal on the ground if you're aggressively cornering. The pedals are cheap, plastic platform pedals. The one nice thing about them is they do have really nice gaps in here for your pedal straps to go through. The bike did not come with pedal straps, which I thought was strange. You're definitely going to want those, but at least they gave you pedals that will fit pedal straps really well. The sprocket is a stamped steel sprocket, so that's pretty cheap. And on top of it, just so you know, another way you can tell it's cheap, not just that it's a stamped steel sprocket, but it's held onto the cranks and keeps it from spinning with a bolt right there that comes in from the back of the sprocket into the crank arm. I've heard from people who ride pretty aggressively and ride a lot that this can actually wear out. This junction here where the bolt goes into the crank arm, the sprocket will actually get ovaled out and it will slip. It turns out that the sprocket actually slips on this bike right out of the box. Let me show you what I mean. Let me close up on the sprocket and the cranks here. So the sprocket is attached to the crank arm with a bolt that runs through the back of the sprocket into the crank arm. The side that attaches to the sprocket doesn't have one of these slots. It actually has a hole drilled in it. That hole is drilled too big, and it causes, when you change directions on the pedals, it causes it to slip. Let me see if I can show you what I mean. So if I'm pedaling forward, and I'm really jamming on the pedals, and then I suddenly backpedal, or I throw it into a skid, it'll slip. You probably can't see that, but I can feel it. Let me go forward again though. You can even hear it slipping. So again, I backpedal, I can feel it slip, and then I push forward again, and it slips. It's really noticeable when you're riding, even though it's not real noticeable when you're just looking at it on this video. You can really feel it when you're riding. So I tried to fix that by replacing the bolt that goes through the back of the crank to a little bit beefier bolt. They usually come with these kind of cheap bolts in the back of the cranks. So I replaced it with one of these. This is a metric 10 by 1.5 thread bolt. You can get it at Home Depot. I often replace these on my bikes because these are beefier than the ones that come on bikes. The ones that come on bikes generally, they use a smaller metric, they use a smaller Allen wrench, and so you can't really crank down on it without stripping it out. These are a lot beefier, they're deeper, and they use a bigger Allen head, so you can really jam down on this and get it tight. So I replaced the back bolt, the sprocket bolt, with one of these guys and really cranked down on it, and it still doesn't help. You can still see it slipping. They did include a half-length chain, which is nice. It is a generic chain. It's not a KMC or anything that you would have heard of. It is a generic half-length chain, but it looks pretty beefy, and I think it'll hold up well. It's a 33-tooth front sprocket, made it to a 16-tooth rear cog. 16 teeth is pretty typical. The nice thing that they did do is they put a 33-tooth on the front, which means that you'll actually get 16 skid patches on the tire. You won't get, if they put a 32 on here, you would get one skid patch. It means every time you skidded with your pedals in standard position, say you normally like to skid with your pedals like this, you would always hit this exact same spot on the tire, and you would wear a hole in that one spot on the tire. But since they made this not a 32, but they made it a 33, you'll actually get 16 skid patches distributed around the tire, which will make your tires last a little longer. Let's do some fixed gear math. If I have a 32 tooth sprocket and a 16 tooth cog, that's the same gear ratio as if I had a 16 tooth sprocket and an 8 tooth cog, right? Because 16 times 2 and 8 times 2 gets you the same ratio as this. And as we all know from elementary school math, you can get rid of the 2's. You get 16 and 8. Now, if that's true, then it's also true that that's the same gear ratio as 8/4, which is also the same gear ratio as 4/2, which is also the same gear ratio as 2/1. These are all the same gear ratios. Now, of course, there's no such thing as a gear ratio of a 2-toothed sprocket and a 1-toothed cog. That's impossible. But it is the same gear ratio. And when you're figuring out skid patches, what you are doing is you're figuring out, you take your gear ratio and you reduce it down as far as you can. And then this one, that's your skid patches. So you can see the problem I have when I have this gear ratio, 32/16, is I have one skid patch. That's a problem. That means I'm going to wear out my tire in one spot. What they did on this bike was nice. They have a 33/16, right? Can I reduce that? Well, let's see. 33 is 3 times 11, and that can't be any smaller. Those numbers don't get it break down any further. 16 is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. I can't eliminate anything here. So that means because of this gear ratio, I have 16 skid patches. That's pretty nice, right? This is math you can do anytime you want to change your gears to make sure that you don't end up with this situation where you only have one spot on the tire that you hit every time you skid. The weird thing is, this is a really low gear ratio. 33/16 is about a 2.06 gear ratio. That's very low. I normally run like a 2.35 gear ratio, which means I would need a bigger sprocket or a smaller cog, one or the other. And even that's considered low. Most people run like a 2.5 or higher. 2.06 is very, very low. And what that means is that if you want to go fast, you're going to have to pedal really fast. It'll be nice if you go up hills. It'll be easier to get up hills, even steep hills, because the gear ratio is so low. But when you're going down hills, you're going to be more likely to spin out. It's going to want to drive these cranks really, really fast when you're going downhill. And so you're going to have to be slowing yourself down a lot going down hills so that you don't spin out. The wheels have a semi-aero profile. They're supposedly double wall rims. I didn't check that. I assume that's true. They have a glossy black paint job, which I'm not super fond of. I wish they had made it matte black like the rest of the bike. Presta valves in the bike tubes. They have Kenda Cosmos tires. I'm not sure what I think of these tires just yet. They have a unidirectional tread, which means you can run the tire in any direction. It's not expected to go one way. So if I was to take this wheel off and flip it 180 degrees and put it back on, it would look exactly the same. I normally run a smoother wheel than this, not something with this kind of an aggressive tread. But I'm going to give it a try and see how they go, see how they skid, how they feel. They're a 42 millimeter width, which is nice and beefy. The rims are laced to hubs with 32 spokes, pretty typical. Some real aggressive riders like 36 spokes. This gives you a little more strength, but 32 is pretty typical. They say crew on them. These hubs look exactly like the ones I've seen on state bikes, on retro spec bikes. They're probably all made in the same factory. So don't expect a whole ton out of these hubs. They are sealed bearing, which is nice, but they're not the greatest quality. They're also not the cheapest you can buy. So they are what they are. The rear hub, again, it's this sort of generic hub that says Crew on it. Again, it's the same hub it's the same Chinese hub that you find on any other low-end, beginner-level fixed gear bike. It's a flip-flop hub. They comes with a freewheel, 16-tooth freewheel installed on one side and a 16-tooth cog on the other side. I haven't checked that this is tight. I assume it is, but I'll find out when I go to ride it whether or not it's tight. This is important. The cog was actually not tight on this hub. I had to tighten it several times. So I took it out for a ride and could feel it slipping. I brought it home, took the wheel off, put a chain whip on the cog, cranked down on it, put a lock ring tool in the lock ring and tightened it down. Took it out for another ride and I could still feel it slipping a little bit, so I brought it home, did the whole thing again. I've had to tighten this cog and lock ring about 3 times. I think I've got it pretty tight now, but just be aware that out of the box the cog is not tight enough. If you don't have the tools to get it on there tight, you're going to definitely want to take that to a bike shop and have them take care of it. Standard kind of stamped steel cog and lock ring. This is a pretty typical threaded track hub. I have not had a lot of luck with these cheap track hubs, so I'm going to be interested to see how this one holds up. If you put a lot of pressure on this, you can actually have this this lock ring strip and fly off. If you're going real fast and you do a lot of skidding, which I tend to do, the back pressure on this cog can actually, the force of it trying to unscrew can actually pop this lock ring off and strip your whole hub out. And I've had that happen a couple of times, so I'll be interested to see how this holds up. The hub spacing on these wheels, the rear wheel is 120 millimeter. It's pretty typical for modern track bikes. The front hub is 100 millimeter, also again fairly common. So these are going to be common sizes if you want to replace the hubs or replace the wheels at some point. You're going to want to know what that spacing is. It's 100 on the front and 120 in the back. So let's talk about the brakes on this bike, because they're not great. Okay, up in the cockpit you've got these generic Tektro levers. You can see I haven't adjusted the brakes yet and they need an adjustment pretty badly. These are typical sort of Walmart bike, big box store bike brake levers you'd find on a mountain bike or a BMX bike. Tektro levers, they're pretty common. Generic brake cables. These aren't great brakes. They're pretty much expecting that you're going to take them off. If you do take them off though, be warned about what I said about the hub. I have had these hubs, these cheap Chinese track hubs, I have had them come apart on me. So I may leave the front brake on this bike, even though I normally take the brakes off. I will probably take the rear brake off and get rid of all this cable assembly and this lever. I may leave the front one on at least for a little while until I get a feel for the hub. If I do leave it on, I will probably pop this off of here and run this cable down through the headset, and then it comes out at the fork and it'll come down. It'll actually come down the other side. It'll come down here and loop back up and go up into the brake. Now to do that I'll have to switch this piece and this knot. I'll have to take these off and see if they'll switch. Hopefully they will, and I'll be able to run the brake cable down through the headset instead of on the outside, and then you can actually bar spin the thing. And right now obviously you can't. There's clearance for bar spins, but you can't do it because the cable gets in the way. I can confirm after a few rides that the brakes are not so good. If you plan to keep the brakes on this bike, you're probably going to want to upgrade to some better brake pads, like some Cool Stops or something along those lines. What's my overall impression of this bike? Not bad. One thing I do want to mention, the weight of the bike, according to my bathroom scale, is about 22.5 pounds. I apparently don't know how to use a bathroom scale. After re-weighing the bike, it clocks in at 28.5 pounds. A little heavier than I was hoping for, but still not too bad. It is an entry-level bike. It has some good and some bad, like I mentioned. Like any entry-level bike, you're going to get some good stuff and some bad stuff. The good stuff on this bike The wheel set's not bad, it's okay. The cranks are pretty nice. The integrated headset is pretty nice. You know, the weight of the bike is good. The geometry is not bad. I wish it was a little tighter in the back than it is, but other than that, the geometry is pretty good. It seems reasonably upgradable. I will need to make some changes to the bike as time goes on. I may do a follow-up video if I ride this for any period of time and let you know what changes I made, but off the top of my head, the changes that I probably will make. First off, the pedals are for sure going to need some straps. I luckily have some lying around in the shed, so I'll get those on there today. I'll probably have to cut down these bars. They're really wide to me. I'm used to riding narrower bars than this. I'll probably cut an inch off each side, get them down to 24, 25 inches. They're probably closer to 27 right now, is my guess. I measured the bars. As you can see, they come in a little over 27.5 inches wide, not including the bar ends, which aren't actually part of the handlebars. Removing the brakes. I would like to remove the brakes, but like I said before, I need to make sure I can trust this rear hub first. I have had a couple of these rear hubs explode on me, and so I don't want to take the brakes off, because having your rear hub fail on you when you don't have brakes is a pretty scary proposition. I'll probably leave the front brake on. It will need a pretty serious adjustment. Right now, how it comes out of the box, it's not adjusted. I will need to adjust the brake to get it working. And as I mentioned earlier, I will probably try and run the brake cable down through the headset and then back up to the brake, so that way you can actually spin the bars. Pivotal seat and seat post would be another nice upgrade. I'm not sure if I'll bother with that. The seat post on this bike is actually not bad. The seat's kind of a piece of junk. I'll probably replace that pretty quickly. Whether or not I'll go to the trouble of putting a pivotal seat and seat post on there, I'm not sure, but it would be a nice upgrade. The stamped steel sprocket kind of bugs me. I would like to get a nicer sprocket on there. The downside is 33 teeth is not a common size. Common BMX sprockets are 25 teeth. Anything other than that is going to be kind of an oddball size. So I'll need to think about whether or not I want to replace that. I'll probably ride this around a little bit, see how the gear ratio feels, and decide what I want to do about that. I mentioned several times, I'm not sure I trust this rear hub. We'll see how it goes. If I was going to spend any real money on this bike, it would be replacing this rear hub or possibly this entire wheel. There are several companies that make hubs that don't have this standard track hub, screw-on cog, screw-on lock ring assembly, which is frankly not trustworthy. There are a couple of different companies out there that make solutions for this. Some of them are sort of a BMX style cassette hub, where instead of a cassette driver that freewheels, you actually just have a fixed driver that goes into the hub. That's really strong. They tend to come in 9-tooth and 10-tooth sizes. That's a little small for me. I don't really like 9 teeth or 10 teeth. Trying to get the gear ratio I want on a 9-tooth cog is tricky, so I don't like that. I actually like to run like a 13-tooth. To do that, there's some other options for bolt-on cogs that don't screw on, that won't screw off or blow out on you. So there are several companies that make systems for track bikes. Now those hubs alone are about $200. So that would be a serious investment in this bike. I'm gonna ride it for a little bit first, see if this is a bike I'm gonna hang on to, and if it is, then maybe invest in a better rear hub or rear wheel. And the other upgrade I would potentially make, again, I won't know till I ride it, is these tires. Not loving these tires. They're okay. I'll have to see how they ride, but I have another set of tires which are 38 centimeter tires. They're a little bit narrower than this, and I like them better than these, so I may swap those tires out for these. See how it goes. Overall impressions though of the Crew Defender, it's not a bad bike. It's entry level. It's upgradable. The frame is not the greatest quality, but it's not bad, and it does allow you to run some pretty big fat tires, which is cool. I wish the frame geometry was a little better. It has a mix of good parts and bad parts. We'll see how it rides. That's it. Thanks.